Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Discovery. My name is Alison Mostowich, and I am the Director of Engagement at Efficiency Canada. I am joining you from Mohkinstsis, which is the Blackfoot word for Calgary, meaning elbow. In the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the beautiful traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, and other Nakoda Nations, and the Métis Nation within Alberta District 6. So for those of you joining us for the first time, Efficiency Canada hosts this session, Discovery, about every 2 weeks. And these sessions are meant to bring the sector together, people who are interested in learning about energy efficiency, or learning about new research findings from pilots, relevant topics, or innovations. So again, we welcome you. So before we get started, just a reminder to everybody that our guest speaker will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And you can actually like questions that have already been asked. And the more likes they get, the higher propensity they have to get asked. So if you see something you like in there, make sure you click the like button. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Geni Peters. She is with Eco Canada, and she is here to talk about their latest labor report, Energy Efficiency Employment in Canada. So with that, Geni, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Alison. And thank you to everybody for attending today. We are glad to have an opportunity to pass along some of our interesting research findings to another audience. Let me start off with an acknowledgement that this research was funded by Natural Resources Canada, and we are greatly appreciative of the funding that they provided for us to be able to do this. Just a quick introduction to Eco Canada for those of you who don't know us. We are the steward for the environmental workforce. We're a not-for-profit organization started in 1992, and we promote responsible, sustainable economic growth by ensuring that Canada has an adequate supply, highly qualified energy and environmental workers across Canada. We act as a strategic partner to industry, academia, and practitioners. We have a wide spectrum of stakeholders, and we do that through a number of different initiatives, including trainings that we offer both online and in person, the research that we do, which I'm going to talk a little bit about some of that today. We also provide an EP, Environmental Professional Certification, to those who are experts in environmental work. We accredit post-secondary educational programs in the environmental field. We also provide wage funding to new professionals trying to get into the workforce for the first time. And then we provide HR services to small and medium-sized companies that may not have their own internal HR staff. And we provide those services at a lower cost than most HR consulting companies do. So that's it. Let me throw it over to the research that we're doing. So a little bit of background. The research that we have just published is actually the second report. It's an update of research that we did back in 2019. The study that was done in 2019 was designed to mirror the research done in the United States on energy efficiency activity and employment. Each year, the US EER, US Energy Employment Report, is published. USEER is the name for it. And we have replicated that, just the energy efficiency component of their research. The research objectives were to assess the workforce size of the industries directly involved in the supply of energy efficiency goods and services in Canada. There are 6 industries, we'll talk about those in just a minute, that we felt were relevant to those activities and that contribute to a large amount of the energy efficiency employment. We also wanted to provide information on the number of workers, the revenues generated by energy efficiency, and the employment income by geographic region as well this time. In our 2019 study, we didn't have the funds to be able to do a larger sampling, so we weren't able to report the geographic regions, but this time we are. We also wanted to measure what the international export capabilities of energy efficiency establishments in Canada are. This is a question that was asked by Global Affairs Canada. They were interested in finding out about the international export activities of this space. and then to help quantify the GDP impact of energy efficiency employment in Canada. So a brief introduction to the methodology. First off, when we talk about energy efficiency business establishments, we're talking about organizational entities. They don't have to be the entire company. They can just be like one factory or one manufacturing site or one office of an organization. We reached out to well over 20,000 of those business establishments that were in the following 6 industries: construction, manufacturing, wholesale trade, professional and business services. That includes professional, scientific, and technical services, as well as administrative services and waste management and remediation. We also looked at utilities sector and then other services. Other services includes individuals or organizations that are engaged in either not-for-profit or charitable activities, or maintenance, installation, and repair of equipment. So when we reached out through a telephone survey for the most part, and that was fielded November 13th, 2023 through January 9th, 2024. We had 2,600 or 2,700 roughly business establishments give us good responses, which is giving us a good reasonable margin of error of just under 2%, which makes us confident of the statistics that we're providing. So a brief overview. When we expand or impute the activity across the country based on our sample, we estimate that there are over 55,000 energy efficiency establishments or establishments that are engaged in energy efficiency activities, whether it's providing energy efficiency goods or services. That's slightly higher than it was back in 2019. I think there was about 8.7% growth between 2019 and 2024. We see that the largest proportion of those companies are in the construction sector in Canada, followed by the professional and business services, and then the other services sector in terms of the number of establishments. Operating revenues generated by these 6 industries, or the energy efficiency activities in these 6 industries, was more evenly distributed, with construction and wholesale trade leading the path in terms of their contributions. I've got a more detailed breakdown in the slides in a little bit, so you can take a closer look at some of those numbers. Overall, energy efficiency activities contributed $35.7 billion to Canada's GDP, which makes up roughly 3.5% of those 6 industries' output, not 3.5% of Canada's total output. Now, given that the construction sector dominates in terms of the number of establishments, it's not entirely surprising that we see that the export readiness of the organizations polled was relatively low. Overall, we had about 85.4% say that they do not intend to export any energy efficiency products or services, while 9.2% said yes, we currently export. Another 3-4% said that they intend to be ready over the next 1 to 3 years. In terms of energy efficiency employment, first let me start and talk a little bit about who we categorized as an energy efficiency worker. An individual who's an energy efficiency worker or qualified worker in this study is an individual who's a permanent worker of one of these energy efficiency establishments, and their activity level could be less than 50% energy efficiency activity or more than 50% or all energy efficiency activity. So they don't have to be devoted 100% of their time to energy efficiency work. When we look at that broad spectrum, we have over 466,000 permanent energy efficiency workers across Canada, and they earn approximately $16.7 billion in employment income. The number of employment, the employment number is about 7% higher than it was in 2019. That's actually a slower growth than we had anticipated. In our 2019 report, we had actually predicted that there would be 7% growth in employment over the next year. relative to the initial publication. So between 2019 and 2020, we didn't see that growth, or rather we saw some growth, but then we also believe, and this is a speculation because we don't have the data, we believe that there was probably a contraction in the energy efficiency employment across Canada during the COVID pandemic. And so we're not entirely surprised to see that. And when we look at the US, we see that same sort of trend where there was a decline in employment during the 2020, 2021, 2022 period, and then a recovery thereafter. When we take a look at the distribution of energy efficiency workers across Canada, we see that they're distributed more or less like the population across Canada, with Ontario dominating with energy efficiency employment, followed by Quebec and British Columbia. Alberta is a little bit less well represented relative to our population. And then we have smaller numbers of energy efficiency workers in the other provinces. When we asked about the types of sub-technologies that these energy efficiency workers were engaged with or working with, we found that the traditional lighting and HVAC services and energy efficiency, Energy Star equipment for heating and cooling dominated the activities. The traditional HVAC goods, control systems and services was higher than the Energy Star or high efficiency heating and cooling equipment. We expect that that's probably going to change over time as more and more heat pumps and other types of technology are embedded into the building stock. But that also brings us to another interesting question, which is how does this compare to the United States, and what sort of growth do we expect to see in that? We did note that there is a very slow stock turnover in Canada, and that Canadian households in particular are a little bit more hesitant to go ahead and spend the money on new equipment unless the old equipment has completely died. So we find that although there is a lot of energy efficiency activity in the HVAC, it's slowed relative to the United States because of the hesitancy to turn over the stock, or the slow turnover in building stock. In terms of the growth predicted for the energy efficiency workforce, there are a couple of interesting results. One is we did see that these companies were predicting some rapid growth in their jobs for energy efficiency workers, with 8% growth over the 12 months following the survey. That would add another 37,000 energy efficiency jobs across Canada. Most of those jobs, or not most of those jobs, but the highest growth rate for those jobs is in the other services category, the installation, maintenance, and repair of energy efficiency equipment. So we see about 8% growth, or a little bit above or a little bit less in the other sectors, with the 16.6% growth anticipated in the other services sector. Now, the caveat to this is organizations are having trouble finding the right staff. They're having trouble hiring. And so this growth forecast is for the number of jobs available, but it doesn't necessarily reflect the number of workers that are going to be employed over the next year. So the demand for these workers is anticipated to grow quite quickly, but struggles for hiring are also expected to continue. When we asked about hiring difficulties, we found that the majority of, or more than 50% of all of these sectors said that they were having a very difficult or somewhat difficult time finding the right staff. The manufacturing sector was the least problematic in terms of hiring difficulties, with 48% saying they weren't having any difficulty finding trained staff or adequate staff. But the construction sector, as I think we might have heard in other research, is really having a hard time finding qualified workers. The one area in particular where qualified workers are in short supply, or the types of workers that are in short supply, include installation and maintenance workers. But it also includes sales staff and business development and managers and supervisors as well. So it's not just the installation and maintenance staff that are in short supply. In terms of the reasons for the difficulty hiring, the main two reasons that were provided were that there was stiff competition for staff or a small applicant pool available to these particular companies that were hiring. And also that the applicants that they were getting were not qualified, were not certified in order to be able to do the work that was required. A quick look at the demographics of the energy efficiency workforce. We found that little bit more or a little bit less than 2 in 10 or a little bit less than 20% of Canada's energy efficiency workers identify as female, as compared to 50% of the workers overall across Canada. That's not entirely surprising, given that the construction sector dominates in terms of the number of establishments, and that it also dominates in terms of the number of energy efficiency workers as well. So the imbalance in the construction sector is largely driving the imbalance in the overall energy efficiency workforce. We also find that the energy efficiency workers are required to have lower education or have lower education than the overall workforce across Canada, where 7 in 10 Canadian workers have some sort of post-secondary degree or certificate. Fewer than 4 in 10 have, in the energy efficiency workforce space, have a certificate or degree of some sort. We also asked about Indigenous representation and found that about 3% of the workers in the energy efficiency space were considered to be Indigenous workers or considered themselves to be Indigenous workers. And that's compared to about 4% for the population across Canada. Let's take a short detour and take a deeper dive into some of these sectors and see what's going on in terms of the energy efficiency workforce in those particular sectors, the employment income, and the percentage of the time that these workers are spending on energy efficiency activities. So construction, as I said before, has the largest number of energy efficiency establishments. Out of the 55,000 that we have, 42,410 were identified as construction organizations or construction establishments. They generated about $54 billion in energy efficiency revenue. And they also generated about $11 billion in employment income for energy efficiency workers. The number of energy efficiency workers reported to be or estimated to be employed in the construction sector was over 300,000. And 65% of those workers spent all or most of their time on energy efficiency activities. Looking at manufacturing, we see that the manufacturing establishments are far smaller in terms of numbers. We have only 1,347 energy efficiency establishments in manufacturing. They generate 16.8 or nearly $17 billion in energy efficiency revenue, approximately $1 billion in employment income, with 27,000 workers in energy efficiency. 62% of those workers spent all or most of their time on energy efficiency activities. The wholesale trade industry is the second largest contributor to energy efficiency operating revenues, generating $36.9 billion or $37 billion in revenues. And that's from only 2,004 energy efficiency establishments. We're generating about twice as much in terms of employment income, about $2 billion compared to manufacturing, with 45,000 energy efficiency workers. And those workers, 52% of them spent all or most of their time on energy efficiency activities. Moving on to professional and business services. This is an area where we include consulting firms and organizations that are engaged in engineering, procurement, and that sort of thing. That leads us to about 6,047 energy efficiency establishments estimated to be across Canada, generating $15.7 billion in energy efficiency revenue. $1.9 billion in employment income for energy efficiency workers. With 50,000 energy efficiency workers, 42% of those spent all or most of their time on energy efficiency. The utility sector is a little bit more of a challenge to create estimates for because we have such a small sample. There are so few utilities companies or establishments across Canada. 392 were identified as energy efficiency establishments, generating about $2 billion in energy efficiency revenue and $26 million in energy efficiency employment income. Now, that said, that the utilities industry was the smallest share of energy efficiency establishments, or at only 1% of establishments, but accounted for 4% of energy efficiency operating revenues. The other services sector is where we're going to wrap up today. We have energy efficiency establishments in the number of 2,947 for other services. Again, that includes not-for-profit and charitable organizations, as well as the installation, repair, and maintenance of equipment. They're generating $561 million in energy efficiency revenue, $640 million in employment income, and they had 26,000 energy efficiency workers in that sector. And 57% of those workers spent all or most of their time on energy efficiency. So that's it for my presentation. I look forward to having some really robust discussions and questions coming forward.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Geni. I'm strongly identifying in the other category right now. It sounds like just an incredible amount of work went into that. And I'm really hopeful that we get to see it again. And we get to see another iteration of this when COVID is not part of the equation, because yeah, I think COVID just turned all models on their head for the last few years.
Absolutely.
So I see a couple questions in the inbox right now. So I encourage you to throw your questions into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And if you see one you like, feel free to like it and upvote it. So we are going to start with a couple questions about the different businesses. So did you find a difference in the businesses and the business models they follow that found hiring easy versus difficult?
Well, that's a good question. Unfortunately, the information that we gathered isn't sufficient to be able to make that type of assessment. The information gleaned from the companies was kept to a minimum so that we didn't have to burden them with the survey. That is something that we would like to do some more research on in terms of maybe a hiring study to see whether that really did have an impact.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Sometimes the scope is really important of these different surveys. Just to get people to answer, it's tough.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the role of governments, either federal or provincial, to support energy efficiency activities? Was that part of the data that you collected, or did it flavor any of the information?
That's a good question as well. No, we didn't look at the public administration sector. We know that there are workers that are devoted to energy efficiency policy and regulation activities, but we were looking more at organizations that are producing energy efficiency goods and services for the private sector, within the private sector. So we don't have a good grasp of that. It's an interesting question and something that we would like to look into in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally fair. Okay, I like this question. I think this is really interesting. Was part of the data the seniority of the labor demand? So are you seeing a lot of entry-level positions, or, when you're seeing the growth in the different areas, where are those positions sitting at?
That's a really good question as well. As I said, we have less information about that simply because of the nature of the survey. But I can say a couple of things from other research that we've done and from the results that we did find. One is that managers and supervisors were definitely one of the types of staff that were difficult to hire for, which we assume that managers and supervisors are going to be more senior in the organization, are going to have to or require more experience and potentially more education as well. But we also know that there are a high number of retirements going on across Canada. We still have a relatively high retirement rate as the baby boomers are sort of tailing off their careers. And so we do anticipate that there could be a lot of senior level or mid-level manager or non-manager positions, experience level positions where we would see openings. So succession planning is a concern to a lot of these organizations, and making sure that the staff that they are bringing in have an adequate, not only technical knowledge, but also the personal and professional skills that are required in order to lead a team and to engage in stakeholder communications and the different types of teamwork that's required. Multidisciplinary skills are also in high demand, project management skills. So we know that we are asking a lot for some of these workers to come in with more than just the basic technical skills.
And I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. So when you see these results in your papers, you did give a little bit of an introduction about Eco Canada, but what do you do after a report like this? Is there some sort of, I guess, concentration of resources on maybe shifting towards helping the energy efficiency sector, or where you see gaps? What does that look like for Eco Canada, and what are you already delivering that is specific to energy efficiency?
No, that's very good. I think in general, what we do is we take the information that we've gathered to give us a better idea of what sort of training we would be interested in developing for the workforce. We also do a market survey. So we don't want to replicate work that's being done by other organizations. We know there's a lot of great training out there for energy efficiency workers already, but we do want to fill in the gaps. So for example, we do have a great training on project management, which could be relevant to an energy efficiency worker, some leadership training, that sort of thing. So maybe the more personal and professional skills is where we would step in. In terms of supporting energy efficiency organizations, it just keeps us aware of the fact that these organizations are having trouble hiring, and that gives us an opportunity to potentially provide our services to them at a lower cost than they could afford it at other private consulting companies. And then another space where we're working is we've got a number of projects, not necessarily specifically in energy efficiency, but in net zero emissions reduction type activities. And we're doing trainings to help organizations measure their emissions and to work towards reducing their emissions through energy efficiency activities, as well as other types of technological changes.
That's fantastic. I love that you do that survey. It's a bit of a small world with the training sectors, and it's nice that we can all support each other. So this is, I think, an interesting question. So you had talked a little bit about the statistics in terms of representation of Indigenous communities. And we have somebody wondering that about other statistics that may have come out of the data related to either Indigenous, First Nations, Métis, if there were other statistics that they can find in the report, or any findings that you can sort of think of right now that would be specific to those populations.
No, it's another good question. And this is another area where I guess our research and our survey is a little bit high level. We asked people if they identified as First Nation. No, I'm sorry. We asked people if they identified as Indigenous, and then we didn't split out the data in terms of First Nations, Métis, and in a population. I think two reasons for that. One is we were asking employers this information, and employers may not know that particular information about their staff. But the second is because we were dealing with relatively small samples, we're not convinced that the information that we would generate from that sort of a survey would be statistically sound. So we wouldn't want to report something that wasn't reliable.
Yeah, that's totally fair. And to the lady who asked the question, you're welcome to go into the report and see what you can glean. And I think if you're interested in following this work, there are other organizations that track labor in different Indigenous communities too. So I'm sure Geni and I would be happy to chat about that, different organizations that exist. So a question about lighting. So currently most energy efficient lighting are procured and imported from either the US or China. Just curious about the job growth in that sector. Was there any data to give you any gleanings in that area?
Well, again, the overall information was that we are still anticipating seeing some job growth in that sector. I think that the reason for that being the dominant space is that that's the most widely adopted technology or sub-technology across Canada. And so that's, I think, where that growth comes in. I really don't know that we've got any specific information about the types of workers that are involved in that sort of activity. I would be interested to dig into that data myself and find out a little bit more and see if we can pull something. But again, when we're looking at specific subsectors and sub-technologies, the data becomes a little bit less reliable. And so we tend not to report that data.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'd like to ask you, maybe not so much a data question, but I think you had mentioned the two reasons that some of the different organizations are struggling to find workers. In your experience, or even through some of the data or other research you've done, are there bigger contributing factors to that right now, do you think?
Well, I think one is that there is just the overall difficulty in finding workers for the construction sector as a whole. And so, attracting people to construction is a challenge right now. Construction does not offer the same work-life balance as other types of, say, in-office work or even retail work, where you're often, on the ground at 7 a.m. and you might be working until 7 p.m. Doesn't give you an opportunity to easily drop your kids off to childcare. It's not likely that the construction area where you're working is going to be accessible by public transportation. So there are a number of barriers that can contribute to a smaller applicant pool to start with. Another factor is that we do have high growth in terms of the number of immigrants coming into Canada, newcomers in Canada. And although those newcomers may have experience working in the construction sector in their own countries, that may not be considered a qualification for working in the construction sector in Canada. And so the translation of their qualifications to Canadian qualifications, or even getting Canadian work experience, can be a challenge for those individuals.
That's so interesting. You almost have to be of a certain wealth status to make it to your job site to get a job in the construction sector. You have to own a car. You have to have friends that have a car. Yeah, that's really interesting. Abby was just typing about broader policy supports Abby's our specialist on energy, low income energy efficiency and energy poverty. So I'm curious, are you seeing other supports that are working to sort of, I guess, support these different sectors to try to find labor, qualified labor? And do you see some of these sectors making changes themselves to try to fix some of the issues that you were just relaying?
Well, in terms of the second question, I think that the advantage that manufacturing has is that they tend to be more stable 9-to-5 jobs. They are on bus routes, that sort of thing. So and they also do a lot of on-the-job training. So they don't necessarily require the qualifications of the staff when they're initially hired. The more that the staff are required to come in with work experience or qualifications, the greater the hiring difficulty challenges. The construction sector is interesting. I think everybody in the construction sector recognizes the challenges, but they also recognize that construction companies are highly competitive. They're generally very small companies, especially if they're working in the residential sector, especially for retrofits and that sort of thing. And these organizations are fighting just to stay alive. And for them to meet the requirements of their clients, the 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. may be needed. I mean, that may be the only way that they can get the job and get the job done on time. So there are some real issues that need to be balanced in terms of what the company requires in order to just stay alive, and what the employment requirements are of the potential staff that they have.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Just through a lot of the work we do at Efficiency Canada, we talk to a lot of associations, industry associations, and they've also identified that the push towards getting younger people into post-secondary education, like university, and sort of this glorification of white collar versus blue collar has really impacted the labor force as well. So there is maybe a false perception of a lot of these industries as well, and going into them.
Yes, I think that is an interesting issue that well, and it comes, I think, a little bit down to two things. One is the culture shifting towards the white collar work-life balance type activities, but it's also the demographic contribution of newcomers. A lot of newcomers come to Canada with an expectation that their children are going to become doctors, lawyers, accountants, qualified, recognized professionals. And so for their children to go into the trades, although the trades can pay as much as those professional jobs, it's not viewed as a success story for a lot of those newcomer families. And so they do really drive their children to some of these white collar professions.
That's such an interesting finding. So I think, like a lot of our work sort of revolves around tracking energy efficiency in Canada. And so Abby's got a really good question, and I'm not sure the data would have showed this, but do you see any consequences or maybe any correlations in some of the data with the kind of cyclical nature of the programs we have in Canada? Because we know there is quite a bit of government subsidy when it comes to energy efficiency programs, there's incentives. So just curious if that showed up in your data at all, or if you do see any issues in the labor force from that.
Well, I don't think that we can speak to the data aspect on that because, of course, we've really got the two data points, 2019 and 2024. We know that over that period of time, there was a significant increase in the number of programs supporting energy efficiency activity in Canada. And so there is a really good, and I think this would be an interesting study to do. There is a really good question there about whether or not the expectations of the program developers on the government side are consistent with reality in the sense that they spend a lot of money trying to promote these activities, but they don't understand the lag in getting the qualified workers ready for those activities. So, and again, the cyclical nature of government spending, it's not just cyclical, it's cyclical and high impact, high demand very quickly. And so that makes it difficult for organizations to turn around and switch on a dime. So that can really be a challenge.
Yeah, I think we've seen that even very recently in some programs. And I know, and you live in Alberta too, you've seen this real time in, the past 5 years. So yeah, so we're coming pretty close to the end of our time here. So I'd love to just give you an opportunity to give everyone that's in attendance today one takeaway. So if there was one takeaway from the reports that you'd like to leave everybody with today, what would that be?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that the hiring challenges that we're seeing broadly across the economy are being reflected in the energy efficiency space as well. And so it's not an isolated sector in terms of hiring difficulty. That hiring difficulty is reflecting a lot of the challenges that other sectors across Canada are facing at the same time.
That's fantastic. Well, I just wanted to thank you for coming today, Geni. We really appreciate it. This is really important work, and I know we at Efficiency Canada follow this really, really closely. I also noticed on your website that you've got another webinar coming up. So I wondered if you wanted to just talk a little bit about that. I think it's in November.
Yes, that's right. So we're going to be presenting this information in a little bit more detail in a webinar in November held by Eco Canada. Of course, anybody is welcome to join, and some of the material is going to be repeated from this webinar as well, but we're hoping to reach a slightly different audience with that webinar. So if you have questions in the meantime, let me know. Just reach out to the research team at research@eco.ca. And we can get back to you and see if we can help you learn more about the energy efficiency space.
So if you know anybody that would have benefited from this, there's a second chance. And we don't get to say that very often. So I did put the link to the report in the chat. So the webinar information is on that same page if anybody's interested in finding the webinar information. So feel free to go there. And then before we close off today, I just wanted to mention that we hosted a discovery 2 weeks ago with Sarah Riddell, one of our researchers, on modernizing the Energy Efficiency Act, why it's important, and how the Canadian government could do it. So if anybody missed out on that, it's now on our YouTube channel, and I'm just going to post the link quickly in the chat. And then again, we host this discovery session every 2 weeks. So our next session is about policy strategies to build affordable, efficient homes quickly. So if you're interested in that, you can go onto our website. Thank you again, Geni, for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Allison.
Take care. Bye, everyone.